I also rise to speak on the Equal Opportunity Religious Exemptions Amendment Bill 2021 and intend to do so, Acting Speaker, in three parts. Firstly, I'll address what the bill aims to achieve and why I oppose it. The second part being just some general comments and reflections, and finally, Acting Speaker, I'll comment on some of the submissions that have been received from stakeholders, including the Institute for Civic Society, religious leaders, Equality Australia and the Pride Lobby, and also representatives of the legal profession. Acting Speaker, the bill removes the existing legislative provisions that allow religious bodies to decide who to employ based on certain characteristics. And it introduces new provisions that prevent religious bodies, including schools, from deciding who they employ and if religion is an inherent requirement of an employed position. Acting Speaker, I oppose this bill because religious freedom is, in my view, a foundational cornerstone of a modern, tolerant, diverse, inclusive and respectful society. And governments, in my view, should not be the arbiters of what does and does not conform to a certain set of religious beliefs. The separation, Acting Speaker, of church and state matters, and these things must be protected and defended as a pillar of our democracy. Acting Speaker, organisations should be allowed to establish, defend and protect their workplace and their culture. And I notice that the contents of this bill does not pertain to non-religious ethos that guide many other schools. An example of that is a Steiner education. And a Steiner school, which is guided by an educational philosophy of Rudolf Steiner, promotes an unorthodox school program that limits standardising testing. If a teacher in a Steiner school no longer prescribed to the philosophy of Rudolf Steiner, the school would be allowed to exercise their good judgment, and that teacher could be dismissed for not promoting the values and the mission of that school. The purported aim of this legislation is to address, Acting Speaker, discrimination in our communities. However, this very legislation only discriminates against more Victorians. The legislation discriminates against the countless organisations that members of the government take by some measure for granted, and their contribution to the Victorian community. Whether it be a Catholic aged care home, a local synagogue, an Islamic school, the St Vincent de Paul Society, the Salvation Army, a Lutheran bank. These are organisations that contribute to our Victorian community in a particular way. And to discriminate against these organisations in this way is something which I don't agree with. Acting Speaker, just finally on this first part of my contribution, I do note with some hesitation that there are, in my view, two types of persecution that is occurring in our community at the moment. The first type being the overt type, the persecution that we see in Afghanistan against moderate Muslims who are seeking to establish a better community and a better society for their people. The overt type that we saw in 2019 when those Christian martyrs were killed in Sri Lanka. But we also see the sort of persecution that is polite, perhaps disguised as culture, modernity and perhaps even progress, and which ends up taking away freedom and even the right to conscientious objection. Acting Speaker, Mark Snedden, who is a former Crown Counsel to Victorian Labor Attorneys General, now heads the Institute for Civil Society and has given a submission to the government in relation to this bill. I note the Institute's concern with the inherent requirement test, and I quote from their submission: "Victoria is a pluralistic society that celebrates diversity and inclusion. The ALP, the Catholic Church and Equality Australia are not internally very diverse organisations in their worldview or mission, but as organisations with strong commitments to particular worldviews, beliefs and missions, they help to create and sustain a diverse, pluralistic Victoria. None of these organisations should be compelled by anti-discrimination law to hire or retain people who are not active ambassadors for the cause in word and conduct. But this is what the inherent requirement proposal will do to religious bodies and schools. It goes on. The inherent requirements amendment proposed trespasses on several human rights and freedoms, determining how important it is that a person in a particular position conforms to the religious doctrines, beliefs and principles, involves judgment as to the culture and mission and self-definition of the religious organisation and its fidelity to its own religious precepts, a task which is not appropriate for secular institutions and which they are ill-equipped to deal with. I then refer, Acting Speaker, to many representations from religious leaders and organisations. Archbishop Comensoli, of course, the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, wrote to every Member of Parliament. In his letter he said, quote, "The proposed legislation diminishes the ability of faith organisations to confidently manage employment matters according to their faith and conscience." The Archbishop goes on, "In my own context, Catholic organisations are inclusive and welcoming places not despite, but because they are Catholic. I'm particularly concerned that the introduction of an inherent requirement test is a serious intrusion into the expression of faith and an unnecessary instrument of power. The government has been unable to identify a single problem in Catholic schools with which this legislation is meant to address. This is looking increasingly like a willingness to hurt the rightful expression of religious faith, coupled with an extravagant adoption of political power over our lives." I received a letter, as did other members, from some 695 priests, pastors, ministers, elders and deacons, Acting Speaker. All of them are greatly disturbed looking at how this bill will strip away religious freedom and cultural rights, putting their churches, Christian schools and organisations, in their view, at risk of litigation and vulnerable to attacks by people who disagree with their beliefs and value system. And also a letter from some 14 religious leaders, Acting Speaker, including the Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, Rabbi Dr Shimon Cowan, Director of the Institute for Judaism and Civilisation, and also the son of former Governor-General Sir Zelman Cowan. These leaders all expressed how this bill attacks religious bodies, schools and individuals, but political parties, Acting Speaker, still have the ongoing privilege of being exempt from the Equal Opportunity Act. Just last night, Acting Speaker, I received another letter from some 14 religious leaders representing the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, agreed to by Hindus, Ukrainian Catholics, members of the Jewish faith, the Krishnas, Coptic Orthodox, Sikhs, Russian Orthodox, the Board of Imams, the Islamic Council of Victoria, and so on. And so there's great consternation within religious communities, not just Christian, not just Catholic, but a broad range of religious communities to the introduction of this bill. I did meet with Equality Australia and the Victorian Pride Lobby, Acting Speaker, informing my position on this bill. I am grateful. I'm personally grateful for the opportunity to speak with Ghassan and with Sean and for the stories that they shared with me. And I say to them and those that they represent and speak on behalf of, I find that the stories that they have shared with me, particularly tragic and difficult, those experiences should never be experienced by anyone. But it is my respectful assertion, Acting Speaker, that a legislative change is not the way to deal with the circumstances which both the Victorian Pride Lobby and Equality Australia raised with me. And finally, Acting Speaker, I make reference to some comments by those in the legal profession. Patrick Parkinson, who was until recently the Dean of Law at the University of Queensland, said that the legislation is inconsistent with a number of international human rights norms, particularly those which protect the liberty of parents to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. Acting Speaker, I agree with the amendment moved by the member for Gembrook earlier today. It's clear that the government has not consulted broadly enough. This bill should go back to the drawing board, and it's ill-considered and it should be reconsidered.